Welcome to the Poetry Balls podcast with Tola and Filippo. This is Tola. On this episode of the podcast, I have a conversation with Yohan Iddawela. Yohan is a co-founder and co-CEO of Lanterne. Lanterne launched a free app in April 2020 during the COVID lockdown called Crowdless. We have a detailed conversation about Crowdless, his educational background, how he came to be an entrepreneur, his approach to work, and many other topics of interest. I hope you enjoy our conversation. First time we kind of met, I suppose you had just done a presentation. I think it was a joint collaboration with LSC and was it UCL? I can't remember what the collaboration was.
No, it was, I think it was Imperial. Yeah.
Yes, LSC and Imperial.
Yeah.
And you had pitched Crowdless to, I guess, a few investors. And I guess your presentation stood out to me because obviously I'm talking to you now, and the solution you guys created was, well, I guess it stood out amongst the rest for me. So of course I wanted to have a chance to talk to you properly about how that came about. So I mean, I guess before we get into all that, it would be nice to know a little bit more about you and how you got to do your master's and your PhD at LSE. So I'll hand the floor over to you.
Yeah, cheers. The big question. Look, it's been a really windy road. So I'm from Australia, and I guess when I finished school, what I wanted to do in life, and I think I was very envious of all the students that had a clear idea at the age of 16 or 17 that they wanted to become an electrician, a plumber, a doctor, etc. I just had no idea what I wanted to do. So you don't really have much of a framework to working out what to do in life to make that decision. So I just looked at what my mates were doing, and one of my mates was moving from Sydney to Canberra to study law. And I just thought that sounded like a good idea. I'll do that. Didn't have a better way of making a decision. And next thing I knew, I was studying law in Canberra, so the capital city of Australia, at the Australian National University there. And weirdly, I think during the second half of the first year, I discovered a love for electronic music, and specifically techno.
Okay.
And really got into techno and electronic music. But Canberra's a small place. It's about a population of about 300,000 people. And as a result, there weren't too many people who like techno. So I just had this dream of wanting to be a DJ at the one techno night that existed in Canberra.
Incredible.
And I just wanted to be good enough to perform there. And it was hard. You've got a lot to learn when you're a DJ. Things like how to beat match properly, how to build a set, to build up a set, bring it down again, really engage an audience. And
so it's obviously a lot more technical than people think, right?
Absolutely. I think so. With techno, at least, the idea is it should sound like one continuous song. You want to fade in and fade out music without people realizing that it's a new song. And that's all part of beat matching. So you need to learn to match the beat of two songs perfectly so people can't tell that two songs are being combined. Because if you have beats that are off beat, it just completely throws off the audience. So that was certainly something that I had to learn. But I could never get a gig at this one event that was run, this one techno event. So I guess I did what I was forced to do, which is start up my own night, my own events, sort of company with one of my really good friends. So if you can't get accepted into something, you've just got to create your own. And I actually saw that as a really bad thing. I was quite ashamed that I wasn't good enough to perform at someone else's night, so I just had to do it for myself. But I think in
Mm-hmm.
hindsight, that was probably an interesting move to make. And so discovered this love of electronic music, and over time we were very fortunate enough to turn that into an events management company. So we brought DJs from all over the world, from the UK, Israel, every Germany to Canberra, and I got to show off the music that I was really passionate about to everyone in Canberra, and essentially convert people. And that was great for about three and a half. That was great for about 3.5 years, and after that, I really decided I wanted to do something more meaningful or socially impactful in life, and decided to refocus my attention to my studies, and was quite passionate about getting involved in the international development sector. I thought that that was where real social impact would take place. But I just saw that as something that was quite interesting. My parents are from Sri Lanka, so I'd always been really interested in these sorts of issues. So I ended up writing an honors dissertation on microfinance, and I was quite interested in philosophy back then. So I was looking at the intersection of Foucault with economic development, which is very niche in hindsight. Um, and after finishing that, I really wanted to get into the international development sector, applied for a bunch of internships, but just kept getting knocked back because I didn't have a master's degree. So I found my way into a graduate position working for the Australian government, so for the Australian Cabinet Office. And that was really interesting because you were working on policies that were impacting people's lives. And it was great for about a year or a year and a half. And then I sort of began to understand how the public sector in Australia worked, and I was a little bit jaded by it. And the way that essentially I found it to work is that people were less motivated to bring about positive change, but more motivated to deny a blame when things went wrong. I think that was sort of the motivating factor. If you can think of the public sector as being incredibly risk averse, I think that's part of the reason. If something goes wrong, you don't want to be blamed for it. And I'm
So
not talking.
was it heavily political? Would you say?
I don't think it was.
Was that the reason?
No, I think it was more this risk aversion. So this lack of desire to do something new, because new means more things can go wrong, and if things go wrong, you as a department can get blamed for things going wrong. So the safest way of ensuring that things go wrong is to do things as they've always been done. And I think that was sort of the guiding culture I found of the public service. But that said, there were some incredible people in the public service I was working with who were trying to bring about real change, and being able to work alongside these kinds of people was incredibly inspiring.
Right.
But but I always wanted to get back into this space of international development, and I knew I needed to do a master's in order to get into that space. So
Okay.
I looked far and wide, and saw a master's in London at the LSE in local economic development, which was all about bottom-up approaches to bringing about development rather than the top-down approaches of the UN, the World Bank, etc., which I found really interesting. So made the move from Canberra after about 8.5 years there to London, and started studying in 2015 at LSE. And through that program, I was very fortunate enough to have been sent over to Uganda to do some work there. We were interested in examining why manufacturing firms couldn't grow and expand. They were sort of stagnating. And so we went in, me and two other colleagues from my master's program, and surveyed about 120 different firms in Kampala to understand why things weren't progressing as much. And one of the interesting bits of feedback we received was there was a lot of corruption in subnational governments, in local
Mm-hmm.
governments. And I thought that was pretty interesting because everything I'd read was really about corruption in national governments, in the sort of international development literature. And so I wanted to understand a little bit more about, corruption in local governments, and just couldn't find any academic literature on that. And so that led to a bit of a light bulb moment, and I decided to actually pursue a PhD examining that corruption in subnational governments in Africa because of the lack of literature.
Right.
So yeah, I ended up enrolling in a PhD program in 2017. I know this is a bit long-winded. I'll get there to Crowdless.
No. It's fine. It's fine.
And so what happened was I missed out on getting a scholarship for the PhD, which again was a huge source of frustration and disappointment for me. And so I was trying to work out what are some ways to essentially try and make ends meet whilst doing a PhD, because living in London is incredibly expensive. And
Yes.
paying for a PhD on top of that is insanely expensive. And what ended up happening was I took a part-time job for an NGO based in Washington, D.C., but the work was actually based in Afghanistan, and it was also based in Puerto Rico. And I didn't spend too much time in Afghanistan. I probably did 3 trips there and spent a total of 2 months. But it was essentially allowing me to make my way through university. And based on those experiences in Afghanistan, I saw that there was a real lack of good quality security information for people in conflict zones. And I actually met a guy, another Australian at LSE, who had similarly spent some time working in Afghanistan. His name's Alex. And Alex went on to become my business partner. And so what happens when you're working in a conflict zone like Afghanistan for an NGO is you go to Afghanistan and the NGO outsources security decisions to a subcontractor. And that subcontractor is typically based in Kabul. And they pay people to essentially read the news, read social media, have some local contacts on the ground where they can get information on when and where violent incidents have taken place. So those are things like bombings, shootings, kidnappings. And once they hear about something, they'll send you a text alert saying, FYI, there was a VB IED in PD12. And you're like, okay, what does that mean? It's like, oh, okay, vehicle-borne IED in a specific area in Kabul. And I just found
this information was for regular people, basically.
It was for sort of international development workers based in this space in conflict zones.
Okay.
And so I didn't find it incredibly intuitive. And sometimes also because it was a human who was looking at the news trying to get this information, we'd sometimes get these alerts about 3 hours, 4 hours after an incident had taken place. So again, not too useful. You want this information in real time.
Yeah.
So Alex and I wondered whether there was a way to provide more intuitive security alerts to people in conflict zones. And we thought that we might be able to use machine learning to extract information from online media, social media, and then provide this information to a user on an interactive map so they can see exactly where the incident took place and then avoid these violent hotspots. And so that was the genesis of our company, Lanterne. We were all about providing these real-time security alerts to people. And we teamed up with a data scientist that we also met at LSE called Sebastian. And over the next couple of years, we were just refining the model and trying to build a prototype of this. And we were actually about to deploy a prototype of the app in Colombia in January or February this year. Colombia, because that's where Alex is focused on his PhD. So he's currently doing a PhD in international development over at Oxford. So he's spent a lot of time there, understands the environment, speaks Spanish, and Sebastian had also spent some time there. And of course, Colombia is just a lot more accessible to Afghanistan, especially when you want to go out and prototype a product and speak to potential users. But of course, COVID then happened in February this year,
Yes.
and the whole of Colombia went into lockdown. And so we were
Yeah.
faced with this dilemma of, well, what do we actually do? Do we wait for COVID to disappear, or do we try and reapply our skill set, which is actually in crisis technology, to the current pandemic? And so Sebastian came up with this idea for repurposing our skill set to show people how crowded supermarkets are, because this was the height of lockdown. The only place you could go to was a supermarket, and people wanted to make sure that when they went to a supermarket, they wouldn't be queuing up for hours. And that was the idea of Crowdless. He came up with the idea in mid-March, and then on the 20th of April, we actually released a free app into the ether. And the free app, as I mentioned, showed people how busy supermarkets were, so they could choose a less busy time to visit or a less busy alternative. And
Yeah.
because it was the right place, right time for the product, we ended up getting
Yeah.
quite a lot of media traction, and it went a little bit viral. And we got a lot of downloads and a lot of enterprise inquiries because of the media traction and the media coverage. So companies reached out to us saying, "Hey, actually, this data is really interesting. Can we purchase it?" So
Yeah.
that's where we are now. Right now, we're working out how to scale this up and how to sell this data, which is real time and predicted information on foot traffic and crowd density, to
Mm.
corporates and governments.
Fantastic. Fantastic. That was a brilliant answer, by the way. I know you probably thought it was long-winded, but no, it was very concise because there's a lot of information you had to condense in there. So I
Like,
would say, based on what you said, Crowdless what is a derivative of your original solution as a, I guess, a more commercial solution, would you say?
exactly, yes. So right now we're
Yeah,
looking at
yeah.
commercialization
Um,
options.
Excellent. So I guess we can talk about Crowdless. So how big is your team at Crowdless?
Good question. So there's three co-founders, and then we've got about 6 or 7 people helping us out on a part-time basis. And most of those
Heck,
people are technical data scientists who are helping us with
I
the
assume, I
predictions.
assume, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So, so how did you, I guess, gather this team? Because obviously with COVID, everyone's working remotely. It's not the easiest thing to find technical co-founders. That's one thing as well. So how did you guys, the co-founders, end up, from this team?
Yeah, so the co-founding team was, well, I met Alex through a mutual friend because he was from Canberra in London, and someone just said you should chat to Alex. You guys have a lot in common, and he was just happened to be studying at LSE at the same time. And once we realized we needed a more technical co-founder, we went out to all of the different societies, student societies at LSE, looking for a data scientist. And
Yeah.
we stumbled upon Sebastian, and he was a fantastic fit. He was super eager to join the team. We told him about the idea, and then the next day he emailed us and said, "Oh, look, I've created this prototype." So we knew
Wow. Wow.
he was a great fit for us. But then it's been a lot more challenging to find non co-founders to help work
Mhm.
with us, because again, especially as you're an early stage business, you don't have a lot of resources,
Yeah.
and so you need high quality people who are motivated by an interesting problem rather than £100,000 a year salary. And the way that we've managed
Mhm.
to find people we can afford who are excellent is actually through student networks. So
Right.
just emailing student societies at universities around the UK, um, and yeah, just getting leads that way. And then you sort of filter for people who work on similar sorts of problems on the weekends for fun. So if they weren't going to be doing this
Mhm.
for you, they would be doing it anyway, just because they love it. And that's how we built up the
Incredible.
technical.
So I guess these guys, you said about 6 of them. Are they based around the UK, or did you manage to go international as well?
They're all technically based in London, but because of COVID, Many of them have
Oh,
gone back
incredible.
to their respective homes. So we've got
Right.
someone in Poland, someone in France. But
Mm,
hopefully one day in a not too distant future, we'll all be co-located.
excellent. Excellent. Um, so I looked at Crowdless, and it seems very intuitive, right? The solution seems very intuitive, which I guess is what you were going for. Um, I suppose um, you have a lot of technical, non-co-founders. Do you have a design specialist as well, or did you guys just kind of put heads together to figure out how to make this as intuitive as possible?
We have a wonderful designer on our team, Stephanie, who's just phenomenal, and the quality of her work I can't speak highly enough of. And
Yeah.
what and in terms of the intuitiveness of the app itself, a lot of that is also down to user testing. So we created the first version of the app in about a month, but then 2 weeks of that was about refining the design. So we had a website where people could sign up for early access to the app. Then we would reach out to them and show them the app over Zoom, get them to help us out with the designs. So we'd ask things like, you see this button on the left here? What do you think that means? And just test the intuitiveness of the product. And once we'd
Mhm.
gathered enough data points, we'd know how to continually refine that. And as soon as we released one version of the app, we'd bring in more user testers to help us refine the next version. And we continually iterated on that. So I guess the app that you've played around with has been redesigned maybe 3 or 4 times. And we've
Mhm.
spoken to hundreds of people to help with that redesign.
So, how were you able to scale the solution? Because I'm currently in Kent. I'm in Kent this week, and you guys seem to have, well, I guess your solution seems to have stretched out to this part of the country. Because I looked on the app, and um, the supermarkets within my area are on the app, right? So I can actually get accurate data on Crowdless on those individual supermarkets. So how easy was it to scale up over the year? Because it's still a fairly young company. So how were you able to do that in the midst of a pandemic as well?
Yeah, it's again the fantastic work of our data science team. Essentially, we have a machine learning model that provides real-time predictions of how busy supermarkets are. So that uses information like population density of a place, the ratio of population to the number of stores. Users can actually crowdsource information, so that crowdsourced data helps improve and train the model. And we also use mobile location data, which we obtain through our partners. And yeah, that's how we get these. The other thing to note is we're actually deprioritizing this free app just because it is a pandemic, it is an economic crisis, and as an early stage business, we need to focus more on how to make this business sustainable, which is why
Yeah.
we're now focusing on selling data sets to organizations essentially.
So it's going to become more of an enterprise solution than a commercial solution.
Exactly.
Um, yeah. Have you found it's been difficult to commercialize Crowdless? Because, like you said, it is a pandemic, and I guess, and historically, people aren't really good at. Well, people would rather download an app for free than to, you know, uh, pay a pound or two. So, has that been a difficult process for you
Yeah,
to
I
come to
think
the realization that it has to be enterprise? Yeah.
yeah, it's a good question, and we just knew that people probably wouldn't pay for this app, especially going into the long term. So post pandemic, hopefully that will exist one day. People probably
Yeah.
wouldn't derive as much utility from the app as they did during the pandemic. So we were very cautious about building a business around a piece of technology that was only limited to a specific period and time. So the challenge has then been to investigate a lot of the domains where there'll be sustained demand for this type of data. And so, to give you an
Mm.
example, financial services companies might be really interested in this data because if they can measure foot traffic, that is a proxy for the performance of bricks and mortar stores. So that might help inform investment decisions. property managers who run commercial property sites, like these are large mixed-use properties, want to understand where people are congregating in these properties so they can optimize urban planning designs. Micro mobility companies, so these are sort of your e-scooter market, they need to understand where to actually deploy their vehicles so that people will ride them, because they don't want to be deploying vehicles in an area where no one walks past. So these are the
Absolutely.
industries where we're investigating at the moment, and it's just taking a bit of time to determine and prioritize the first industry and begin developing and selling a product to them.
Mm, mm. Um, so I guess you guys are doing a lot of use case scenario building, basically, to try to understand precisely how the solution is going to, grow in the future, post pandemic.
Yeah, and I want to say it's less of us going into a room and thinking about what is the best market, as opposed to us actually going out and speaking to customers or potential customers from a wide range of market segments. And so we're speaking to a lot of different customers, gathering data points and really understanding the pain points that they have, their willingness to purchase a solution that can help them address these pain points and whatnot.
Right, right. In terms of Crowdless being able to, I guess, go viral, how did that happen exactly? Was it social media? Was it word of mouth? That's quite.
Yeah, it was actually traditional media. So we were part of the European Space Agency's Business Incubation Center. So that was because the previous idea of Lanterne, this conflict zone technology, was using satellite images to pinpoint bomb craters, essentially. So we
Okay.
were getting some funding from the European Space Agency, and when we changed the idea to Crowdless, they were really enthusiastic about it and wrote a press release. And that press release then ended up getting syndicated across European media. And then we wrote to LSE, told them what we were developing. And again, at that time, a lot of organizations were looking for good news stories, and they heard about us and they just started pumping articles out on social media and on their website about what we were doing. And again, that ended up getting syndicated on newspaper articles, and the University of Oxford did the same. And as you get a few different media articles, then that leads to more media articles. It's sort of a domino effect. And we ended up
Absolutely.
getting across, a wide range of media, from the BBC to the Guardian. And there was just a period of about 2 months, which was just surreal, where we would wake up and all we had time for were sort of media inquiries and interviews. So it was a very surreal moment in time.
Right, right. Um, how has the funding adventure been? Because obviously, with the news coverage you get it and the downloads you get in, I assume that funding is. Do investors approach you, or is it easier for you to approach investors? How does that work?
Yeah, it's mainly been us approaching investors. I still think it's going to be quite unusual for investors to approach you unless you have built a company and exited that company previously. So we were looking for a bit of funding for a pre-seed round to help us sort of scale up the business. And we spoke to a lot of different investors, and the period we started engaging with investors was from about mid-May onwards. And again, that was the middle of an economic crisis. And investors were rightly so being even more cautious than usual. So we had a hard time. A lot of investors thought that the business we were building was also time bound, that it would only be relevant for COVID. So they didn't want to invest in a company which wouldn't be relevant post COVID, so which wouldn't be relevant in 18 months' time or whatnot. So we had to do a lot of work refining the business model, convincing investors that actually this is a sustainable business. But at the same time that investors were being quite risk averse, the UK government, as a way to stimulate economic activity, has been funding a lot of companies through grants. So Innovate UK has been given a lot of businesses during the pandemic. And so we've been really fortunate to have received 2 grants from Innovate UK for sizable amounts of money that are helping us get through. And it's been really nice because we have received this money from the UK government, and we haven't had to give up any equity in exchange for that. So at the moment, we've got 1 angel investor on board, and then the rest is grant funding, and that's our pre-seed round.
Excellent. I guess I'll go back to you. What is your day-to-day like? Like, what sort of activities do you engage in within the company as, as a co-founder? What do you do on a regular basis?
Yeah, it's a good question. I guess it depends from month to month. So previously, a lot of it was about investor relations. So making sure that the company pitch deck was up to date, the financials were up to date, that all of our legal paperwork was put together properly, and then just going out and pitching to investors constantly. And it takes up a huge amount of time. And some might argue it's a distraction from the actual business. Since we've focused less on that in the last month or so, due to all these grants coming through, I've been spending a lot of time on customer development. So that's going out and speaking to potential customers, just to understand what their pain points are, how we could help, what their willingness to pay is, and these sorts of things that I mentioned previously. And grants and running a business also involves a lot of operations. So I've been spending time putting together employment contracts. We've been spending a lot of time just doing grant reporting for these grants that we've been receiving. And again, that is, I feel, a distraction from the core business. And at a startup like us, you really need to be focused on finding product market fit. So essentially that can be thought of as when people actually want the product that you are building and are willing to pay for it. And the only way to do that is to double down on developing the product and to double down on discovering the customers. So we're right now in the process of onboarding a COO, a Chief Operating Officer, who can take over a lot of this operational stuff so that Alex and I, who are both co-CEOs, can focus 100% of our energy on customer discovery and customer engagement.
Fantastic. I suppose the difficulty you face as a co-founder, as you said, is that you're wearing a lot of hats initially. So how have you been able to prioritize what you feel is more important from other activities? So do you have a regiment? Do you have a schedule? Are you like, how do you go about those activities effectively?
Yeah, it's well, I guess to answer the first point, it's a real challenge to have to learn about various different domains of knowledge that I just had no experience in. And I think that is one of the most challenging things about working in a startup, but I also think it's one of the most rewarding and exhilarating parts of working in a startup. It's like learning on steroids. You need to love to learn and back yourself,
Yeah.
back yourself to be able to learn, because I'm learning about marketing, I'm learning about accounting, I'm learning about customer development, machine learning, etc. So there's just so many different things to learn. In terms of prioritizing, we really have a sense of what needs to be accomplished every week. So I meet with my co-founding team every single morning to set priorities for the day. And then we track what our priorities are for the week on an Airtable database as well as on Slack. So we have a clear idea of what is required. We set goals and achieve those goals on a weekly basis and track those goals.
Excellent. I suppose just looking at what you guys have accomplished, what do you think the next year looks like for you guys?
It's so hard. I mean, if you would ask me that 12 months ago, I would have said, well, we'd be deploying a prototype in a conflict zone somewhere. So
Right.
really, with that caveat in mind, I think really the next 12 months is about us working out what the initial market segment is, having a number of contracts for that initial market segment. And those contracts will be for a specific location. So we'll be building a model for one country rather than 20 countries. So in other words, we'll be predicting foot traffic and crowd density in the UK. So I think in the next 12 months, we'll look to expand that out to other countries and hopefully be building up the business in that way.
Excellent, excellent. You mentioned that you had to learn a lot of new things, and of course, that was a question that was going through my head because, of course, you went from studying law to being a DJ to economic relations and development. Machine learning is a completely different domain, right? And it's probably one of the toughest intellectually. You could say that, or technically. How have you been able to, I suppose, grapple with that? In communicating with your non-co-founders in helping to develop the solution.
Yeah, sorry, I think I missed that. What's the toughest domain?
The machine learning.
Oh, machine learning.
So yeah.
So I'm very fortunate enough to have an amazing team. So Sebastian, our CTO, has a lot of experience with ML, and then we've got, I think, 4 data scientists who are working on machine learning. So I'm not responsible for telling any of the data scientists what to do, but I am responsible for understanding what they are doing and being able to communicate that to other people. And I think, so my PhD is quite heavily statistics based, so I can understand a lot of the statistical elements to machine learning. But really, it's just about listening to the experts, asking questions, and then building up a framework to understanding these sorts of things that they're doing in your mind and being able to articulate that. But really, all of the credit comes to having a phenomenal team that can very clearly articulate what it is they're doing to me so that I can then parrot that on to other people.
Exactly. I think that makes perfect sense. I do identify with you in a way that I suppose I never really knew what I wanted to do. Right. I always had so many interests and I always kind of jumped from one thing to the next. What have you learned about yourself through this? I'll say the last year, because now you're doing a PhD. That's a task in itself, and now I suppose you're the CEO of a business. Those are 2 huge responsibilities, and I suppose you're finding some fulfillment in what you're doing. So, what have you learned about yourself, I suppose, and what has been the most difficult part of the journey for you?
So yeah, I think it's a really interesting point that you raise about not having any idea of what to do, and I guess it's just a lot more common than I thought. Back when I was 17, I thought that I was the only person that hadn't figured it out, and you slowly realize that no one's figured it out. They're just figuring it out as they go. And so I think one of the lessons that I've learned is life is actually a slow process of ruling out stuff you don't like, rather than having a eureka moment where you're like, oh, this is what I'm going to do for the rest of my life. That's insanely rare. So that's one thing. I think with the PhD, one of the lessons that I've learned is actually what makes a good PhD student. And I think a lot of people are under the assumption that a good PhD student is someone who is really intelligent or has the perfect background in the specific topic that they're studying. But what I've learned actually is that there's 3 things that makes a good PhD student a good PhD student. And the first is motivation. You need to stay motivated to work on a given topic for 4+ years. So you need to be very careful about choosing your topic. And I think the same sort of thing applies for a business. You need to be motivated to work on the problem for 10+ years, really. The second thing is all about self-discipline. You really need to make yourself work at times with the PhD, because as soon as you just take a day off, that slips, and then that erodes the motivation. So being really self-disciplined is incredibly important. And as part of that, the third thing is really about time management. So when you say that you're going to study, you actually are studying, but you're also studying the right things. You're not just passively reading a book and not doing anything about it. So I think those three things are key to becoming a good PhD student. And I think they're also very relevant to running any sort of business. So
Yeah. I agree with all those points. Hmm, I would say the the trickiest thing I've found. I won't say it's the trickiest, but I think we live in a world where, like you said, like when I was growing up, similar to you, I felt like a lot of kids were like, I want to be a fireman, I want to be a doctor, I want to be a teacher. It's like, okay, how do you know that? It's like I had no clue. I remember there was one point I wanted to be an engineer, but that was because that was the norm, right?
yeah.
And like you said, you get to a point where you have to actually be motivated to work on something for, let's say, 10 plus years, like you rightly said, right? So for someone like, I suppose, like you and I, um, how do you select that particular topic? Does it select you or do you select it? Because, I mean, you've gone through this journey and you're now building a startup in the tech space. Was it the solution that was interesting? Was it the problem that was interesting to you? Or what was it exactly that allowed you to go, okay, I think this is what I might dedicate my time to for the next 10 years?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think one thing that you need to do, and I think this is a saying by Yuri Levine, who was the CEO of Waze. He was said, "Fall in love with a problem, not a solution." And so don't fall in love with, in my case, an app that helps people to go to supermarkets safely, but maybe fall in love with a problem, which is how can people stay safe during a pandemic? Um, for me, I fell in love with a very specific problem maybe a couple of years ago, and that was all about development, actually. So I was really interested in how can you promote innovation in a context that is characterized by poor government quality. So in my time in Afghanistan, well, taking a step back, in development theory, there's this idea that if you want real meaningful change, you need a revolutionary new leader to come on who's going to transform the country that they're operating in. So they need to be a believer. They need to believe in democracy and bring about progressive changes. But the problem with that is you're essentially telling a lot of people, if you don't have that leader, then you just need to wait till you get that. And once you have it, then we can talk. Then we can see how we can improve your living standards. And I found that quite frustrating. So I was wondering, what are some ways of promoting innovation, real local economic development in places that are characterized by poor quality governance? And with this original idea of Lanterne, safe navigation in conflict zones, the broader aim, and this might be a bit foolish or might have been a bit foolish, but the idea was I thought that if people had better quality security information, that could lead to de-risking security environments. And if you de-risk security environments, that means that infrastructure development can take place. So in countries like Afghanistan, if you want fiber optic cables, if you want railway networks built, if you want road networks built, you need to get outside knowledge. So companies from China or Europe to come in and help build that because the knowledge doesn't exist within the country just yet. But everyone outside of Afghanistan looks at Afghanistan and they say, well, no, it's just not worth it. It's too
It's
dangerous.
dangerous. It's dangerous. Yeah.
Why would
Yeah.
I
So,
do it? So I thought our solution could play one very small role in trying to improve economic development in these sorts of places. The question then gets to, well, now that we've pivoted, what is the problem that we've fallen in love with? And right now, it's hard to answer that question because we're still very new to the domain. We're still figuring it out.
mm.
So I'll have to
But I
get
think
back.
the interesting thing about I think the interesting thing about what you're doing is that, like you say, you fell in love with the problem of well, de-risking an environment, right? And that I suppose can be categorized in various ways, which is why you're actually able to come up with different use cases, right? So it's not just about um, de-risking; it's also about population density. Like you can actually calculate that. You can actually use data in very interesting ways, in diverse ways, right? So I love what you said about some falling in love with a problem, because it means that because the problem, even though you have a solution to that, will always birth a new problem. That's just the way the world works, right? So yeah, I thought that was a really good point. Um, I think just to round this up quickly, because I know you have a meeting at 12 o'clock. Um, the hmm, I think you've raised an important point about um, you know, I'm trying to formulate this question for some reason. I just,
That's all right. Take your
I just,
time.
yeah. I'm just trying to formulate this question in the right way. Um, I suppose highlights of your journey so far. I'll just make it that simple. What's been the highlight so far?
So I think I'm definitely someone that has a lot of intellectual curiosity. I just love to learn things. So if I wasn't working, I would be learning something just because derive a lot of enjoyment out of it. So the best thing about this journey has been the exposure it's given to different domains of expertise that I've been able to engage with experts in and sort of learn something from those experts. And it's very different to a PhD, where in a PhD you're focused on some very specific problem and you spend 4 years learning about that specific problem. Whereas, as I mentioned previously with a startup, you're having to learn about various different domains, and it's actually quite enjoyable. And there's a lot of benefit then from being able to take a couple of different domains and join them up in a way that has never been joined up previously. So,
Yeah.
an example of this might be I'm now learning a lot about digital marketing, for example. It's something I didn't have a clue about 3, 4 months ago. But I also know the NGO world really well. And I know the NGO world spends a lot of time speaking to donors like the World Bank, DFID, um, trying to get money to fund an NGO. But actually, if an NGO was able to apply some knowledge and skills in the realm of digital marketing, it could be a way of raising the profile of an NGO and actually attracting private donors to give money to that NGO.
Mm.
So I think NGOs are not too familiar with this domain of digital marketing, and putting them together could be quite powerful and could help reshape some of the operating models of NGOs. That's just one
Mm.
example that comes to mind, but I think there's a lot of it's a really creative process of joining two different domains that haven't really been joined together. I think finally, just on the topic of creativity, I think the people are fundamentally creative. You know this, right? You're running a podcast on poetry. And I think there's various different ways of expressing that creativity. It can be either through art, you can write a poem, you can write a book, you can write a song, or it can actually be through something like building a business, because again, you're shaping a business. And I see that as an outlet for creativity. And so being able to build something with a few of my mates on a topic that we're all really passionate about has been incredibly rewarding.
Excellent, excellent. I'll play on the previous point that you made prior to the question I just asked, because I remember it was playing in my mind and I was trying to figure out how to formulate it. I'm originally from Nigeria, and I was back after 12 years this year, right, just before the pandemic,
Mhm.
right, and similar to you, I always felt the corruption was maybe surface level, right? It wasn't really like endemic in the society. However, I came across a paper that basically broke down the degree to which corruption exists within the society, and it's quite scary, to put it simply. Um, and to your point, you said security is paramount, right? You can't, as much as you want to go about developing the nation without having to wait for a democratic leader, for instance. It's difficult to get others on board because it's just not safe. So one of the ideas I had was we need to address security, because at least if people feel safe to, at least for instance, leave the house, for instance, um, that's a step in the right direction, right? It's just common sense. You want to have safety enables you to move about. It enables mobility, right? So, I suppose, would you is that something that you still want to play upon moving forward with your company? Because as you said, you've kind of pivoted in one direction right now, but the good thing is that as a startup, you can always play in various different domains. So is that something that you still want to look at? And do you think security is enough to, I suppose, bring about the sort of, progressive change that ought to come about?
Yeah, it's an interesting point, this relationship between security and mobility, and how we have moved from being a security company to a mobility company. So I definitely think there's scope for bringing those two things together at some point. As a business, though, it's very important, especially in the early stages, that we don't spread ourselves too thin and try and tackle too many different problems. Actually, that's one of the reasons why companies run out of money in the first place, is because they try to do too much. Our approach really is to focus on a very specific problem where there's a need for our solution and where there's a willingness to pay for the solution. Try and validate the market there, get some initial contracts happening. And once we do that, I think down the track, definitely open to expanding out and going back to the old problem that we were trying to address. But right now, I think we just need to be squarely focused on the current sort of mobility problem that we're trying to address. So yeah, we would love to down the track. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that makes perfect sense. You don't want to spread yourself too thin. And I've seen it done before, especially when you're a person with multiple ideas. You get excited by what the opportunities are. So I think it is important to stay focused. I'll round this up by asking, because you said you love studying fundamentally, you love learning. I mean, you love solving problems, generating new ideas. What inspires you? Where do you get your inspiration from? Do you listen to music? Do you read a lot? Do you exercise? Like, what keeps you healthy enough to do what you love?
Yeah, I do. I do a lot of that. So I'm really into powerlifting. That's kind of my exercise of
Oh
choice.
wow!
But, but there's something about being able to really see tangible improvements or progress. So when you're doing powerlifting and you're working out, you can quantify really easily how much you're improving because you're lifting more weight. And I really
Right.
enjoy that aspect to it. And the whole regiment of waking up early and working out is a great way to start the day. And we all know the benefits of exercise.
Yeah.
I've been doing meditation on and off for the last many years. For I guess I want to say 7 years or so, which has been great. I love to read as well, so I'm constantly reading. I'm reading a book called Life and Fate by Vasily Grossman, um, a Russian author who's essentially riffing off War and Peace. So it's kind of like War and Peace, but for World War II and
Right.
post World
Right.
War II. So really enjoying that. I spent a lot of time, especially in the beginning stages of starting a business, reading business books. But
Mm.
I find them so frustrating because a lot of these business books can be summarized in maybe a paragraph, and they've just fleshed it out into a book. So I do minimal sort of business book reading. Uh, I'm trying to spend more time reading fiction, and narrative nonfiction is fantastic as well. Uh, and then I think just like meeting interesting people, having interesting conversations, and that's one of the things that I really love about London, where you just meet the most diverse people, and especially when you're in the startup game in London, people always introduce you to other people. and it's very proactive in that sense. And Australia certainly isn't as proactive in terms of introducing people who are just randomly or tangentially rather connected. And that's a great way
Is that a
to meet
cultural
people.
thing, or what'd you say was going on there?
I'm not sure. It's a great question. I haven't figured it out. And again, I guess my experience is really from Canberra, which is one of the smaller cities in Australia. And I guess in Canberra, everyone is just a lot more stable. You work for the government, and there isn't this dynamism, I guess, to the startup scene. So that might be one
Mm.
of the reasons, but really, I'm not entirely sure. So I guess those are some of the things that keeps me going. But yeah, what about you? I'd be curious because it's a great question.
It is. I do play a bit of basketball. Interestingly enough, I think it teaches you a lot about yourself, right? Because um, when I play basketball, I always think, well, I believe I'm better than I actually am, and I don't know exactly what I mean by that. Because I think when you are focused and when you're clear-headed, for someone like me, I'm able to do well, right? I'm able to net a three-pointer, that sort of thing. As soon as my focus shifts, I miss, and I know I'm going to miss. So it's like, okay, how do I ensure that I'm focused? What do I do to ensure that I'm not distracted? Why do I get distracted? So you learn a lot about yourself just playing on your own, playing alone on the court. So I do that quite a bit. I read as well. I actually started reading One Piece, by the way, a few weeks ago.
Oh yeah,
It's quite dense.
it
You know,
really is.
it's quite dense. And I wanted to break it up into small parts, just so I could just go through it confidently. Writing poetry, I've been doing that for many years now, and have been doing that every day for the last, I'll say, 7 years, maybe. It's one of those things that I just can't explain because I know it's not, um, it's not something that is easy to read. A lot of people don't find it easy to read, but that never really um, got in the way of my love for it. I love the communication aspect. I love the condensation of ideas. Um, and I always feel like if you do something really, really well, people will gravitate towards it. And I suppose that's how the podcast was born. It was just out of that desire to say, okay, I know people don't get it. You know, a lot of people don't get it. Like, how do I communicate in such a way that people can sort of gravitate around it? You know, so similar to you, I love learning. That's probably my favorite thing to do. I used to love watching films, but I'll say over the last few years, it's not been a great source of fulfillment on any level, artistically or otherwise. You know, so the I've been doing a lot more reading, a lot more just learning. I have textbooks on physics. You know, I don't even know. I
Great.
just I love that curiosity aspect because I think you can always learn something a little bit more, better yourself. And I do tend to sleep well because I think that's fundamental. I think I need to be able to rest my mind a little bit because you have so many ideas. Life can be stressful, so it's important to kind of power down a little bit. So yeah, that's me basically.
Very, very well rounded. And
Yeah. I mean, yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this conversation. Um, I hope we'll be in touch. Um, again, obviously I'm going to be following your progress as well. I think what you're doing is very fascinating. And I wish you nothing but the best.
awesome. Thanks so much, Tola. It was a pleasure. And
Yeah,
hopefully
absolutely,
catch you
absolutely.
here in London next.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.